Hello, Dan Alasso with History for Today. So a couple of days ago, I did a little Zoom webinar for Open Education Week, showing my Minnesota State colleagues what I've been doing over the past several semesters. I made a video of that Zoom webinar, but of course, it had a lot of pauses in it, and it had a lot of spots where I say, which kind of bugs me, so I like to edit those out. Plus, it has other people's faces in the Zoom boxes, not all of whom might be happy to be broadcast on YouTube. So I thought I would go over the highlights and make it flow a little bit better. So here we go. I began teaching at Bemidji State University in the fall of 2017 as an emergency replacement adjunct instructor. A tenured professor had been out on sabbatical, but had informed the university that she was seriously ill just before the semester was due to start, and she was unable to return. So I was hired literally a week before the first day of classes. One of those classes that I took on was World History 2, which is the modern world history half of the sequence, covering from about 1500 to the present. So I picked a textbook that I was familiar with, since the professor hadn't gotten around to doing that, and away we went. At the end of the semester, I was told thanks very much, but I wouldn't be needed again because the professor was planning to return. Then, however, it turned out I was needed because she couldn't come back. I was rehired, and I took over the classes actually in the second week of the semester. That's how sure they had been that she was coming back. Books had already been ordered, and many of the students had already purchased a $150 textbook and a $50 primary source companion. I adapted the lectures that I had designed the previous semester to align them with this new textbook that I was using. And as I was doing this, I had the opportunity to reflect on the ways that these textbooks were both very similar to each other in their kind of skeletal structure, with really just a few details and a few stylistic differences that distinguish them. And that made me curious. So I looked at several more modern world history textbooks, old ones and new ones. And it also occurred to me that I wasn't entirely happy charging 75 students $200 each for textbook and supplement content that they would have paid $5 for if the professor had chosen just the previous edition of that same textbook, assuming all the students could have found one to buy. Also, I was vaguely familiar with the criticisms of textbooks made by people like Jim Lowen, who wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me. And I had already been adding big sections to my lectures to expand coverage of areas that I considered important, like the Columbian Exchange. Plus, I had already written a textbook for my American Environmental History course. I laid out and I published my own American Environmental History textbook myself, and I made it available inexpensively to my students as a print book on Amazon and as a Kindle. So it wasn't really all that unthinkable for me to imagine going off on my own and replacing the textbook. The third semester that I taught modern world history, I actually eliminated the commercial textbook and began using a combination of my own content and primary source readings that I put in a course pack in the online learning management system and that I claimed fair use for. Nearly all of the documents that had been in that primary source reader that the students had been required to buy were actually available online. They were either in the public domain because they were so old and so long out of copyright, or they were government documents, or sometimes content that the authors had made freely available. And I discovered at this time that there was actually a lot of activity in the openly licensed educational content space. And when I discovered that, I began joining Minnesota State's OER, Open Education Resource Learning Circles, which were developed and led by Karen Pikula. I also took a Creative Commons certification course to get a better understanding of the differences between all rights reserved and the variety of more open licensing arrangements that are available. After some thought, I decided I would make my content available with a CC by NCSA license so that people could freely use and adapt my stuff, but would need to cite me as its source and would need to make what they made based on my content also available for free and to slap a similar license on it. This is important, I think, to ensure that the materials that educators like me make and contribute freely to the community actually stay free. Without these stipulations, NC for non-commercial and SA for share alike, it would be possible for a commercial textbook company, for example, to grab the content that I've created and to add it to their own walled garden of content, where the content itself would be technically free, but would require an expensive subscription in order for the students to get to. And this is a subversion of the open idea, which I think a lot of commercial publishers have tried, both to reduce their cost of content and also to make themselves seem hip and up to date. The community actually calls it open washing. As I was becoming more familiar with this material, I started interacting with people outside of my own university system. I went to the OER eFordability Summit at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, where Rajiv Jangiani and Robin DeRosa keynoted and kind of shifted the conversation from just saving students on textbook cost to open education, which I hadn't really thought that much about. I hadn't thought extensively about the pedagogical aspects. They don't really teach PhD historians pedagogy where I went to school, or somehow I managed to miss it. So I've been trying to educate myself on that ever since. Although I still wanted to replace the textbook for my Modern World History course, which I now teach every semester, the learning curve of the OER concept and of the tools and the apps that I wanted to use was a little bit steep. So the first project that I worked on was turning my American environmental history textbook, on which I owned the copyright, into a free ebook. I used an app called Pressbooks, to which I had free access through the Minnesota Libraries Publishing Project. And I submitted the finished ebook to the Open Textbook Library, which is probably the best known curator of open text. One of the important features of the Open Textbook Library is that textbooks are evaluated by other instructors using a pretty thorough format, and that provides a valuable element of peer review. The textbook was accepted and has received several 4- to 5-star reviews, which was a lot of fun for me. I went on to contribute an ebook version of a short handbook for writing essays in the humanities and social sciences, which I had adapted with my father from content that he had written and contributed to the University of California years ago. And then I returned to another OER learning circle and wrote an ebook version of a modern world history textbook. And as I wrote this in Pressbooks, I tested it out on my students. I taught them to use the annotation app Hypothesis, and I assigned them to highlight and to comment on the chapters each week in preparation for class discussions. This had the dual benefits of engaging them in the content and also indicating to me which parts of each chapter were working well and which needed improvement. Since I wasn't telling them what they needed to highlight and respond to, I was able to see what elements caught the students' attention and their interest. And more importantly, I was able to mine the gaps and rework parts that they passed over that were either too confusing or too boring to get the attention that I believed they deserved. Then I went to the OE Global Open Education Conference in November 2019 in Milan. Ironically, while I was there, I met several people from Minnesota, of whom I had been aware, but I had never crossed paths with. It's a 4-hour drive from where I live and work to the Twin Cities, and then we have over 30 other Minnesota state campuses, in addition to the University of Minnesota system and private colleges and universities in the state. I also met with people from around the world, and I was exposed to the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals for the first time. And this was an experience for me like the initial widening of my perspective by Robin and Rajiv's keynote. And actually, I bumped into Rajiv at the Milan conference as well. A talk by Martin Dougiamas, he's the Australian who came up with Moodle and owns that company, really drove home to me the equity and the sustainability issues and the question of what we want higher education to be in 5 or 10 or 25 years. In the next learning circle that I joined, I wrote a U.S. History 2 textbook, adapted from a very popular OER called the American Yop. And this was my first experience of remixing an existing Creative Commons licensed OER. I think I took a big step toward making it my own and shifting its focus from what I considered slightly consensus-driven authoring by committee and a slightly political correctness agenda to a more direct focus on some of the inequalities and the injustices that I think the political correctness was belatedly trying to address. I think that once I've reworked it once or twice more, using it in my courses and altering it gradually over a few more semesters, it will probably be ready for publication as a new thing. Although, of course, I'll continue to cite the original authors and to point out that I'm in dialogue with the previous work that they did. Actually, I think this is how most textbooks are made, but like everything else, I want it to be very visible. Then I returned to the modern world history text. I recruited a couple of collaborators from the Minnesota State system, which actually ultimately collapsed down to just one co-author, and we completed a textbook last semester and put it up on the Open Textbook Library. This semester, I'm running a Highflex community of practice at Bemidji State. Highflex is hybrid and flexible. It was a format that was originally designed by Brian Beatty at San Francisco State University. We have 12 faculty teaching about 20 courses. I'm teaching 4 myself, including the Modern World History Survey. And like my aha moments with open pedagogy and with the sustainability goals, this Highflex experience has also focused my attention not only on the equivalence of teaching modalities between in-person and remote synchronous, like we're doing during the COVID pandemic, and then also full online asynchronous, but also to trying to expand the equivalency across the media through which my course content is accessible to the students. And this has resulted in some new formats for my content, which incorporate the ebook with short videos that I make for each section instead of my previous long lecture videos, in which I even include the questions for discussion that I put at the end of each section in the chapter. I've also begun experimenting with a new knowledge graph of my course content in an application called Obsidian, that most of my YouTube friends will know about, but that many of my Minnesota State colleagues might not. This knowledge graph includes content from the ebook, links to the videos, questions, and also opportunities for the students to add to the knowledge. And this is an exciting new change for me. Obsidian is one of a new generation of note-taking or personal knowledge management apps, many of which were inspired by the Zettelkasten note-taking system of Niklas Luhmann, the German sociologist. The Obsidian Vault that I've created for the students is secure. It's an invitation-only folder in Dropbox, and they can contribute to it. I've put the questions for discussion at the end of each content section, and I've asked the students to answer the questions on that page. This hasn't yet resulted in the types of threaded discussions that I was hoping for, but hopefully improvements in the interface and better questions from me will lead to that. I've also invited, that is to say assigned, my students to participate in the knowledge creation in the graph by adding content to fill in blank nodes. Blank nodes are pages that I've made as I've been inserting the content. And as they're reading, they can choose which keywords or subtopics that they want to learn a little bit more about, go to that page, do a bit of research, and then write a summary that will be useful to their fellow students and cite their sources. Although not all of my survey students are history majors, because this is a course that meets a liberal education requirement, many of them do go on to be social studies teachers. So this is good practice for them. And I think it's valuable for other students as well. So these are a few of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years, sort of evolving from print to an open ed ebook, and now possibly to an even more open knowledge collaboration. It's definitely a work in progress, and I'm not really sure where it will end up, but I'm excited about the possibilities, and I'm very interested in hearing what people think. So I hope folks found that interesting. Thanks very much for listening. I'll see you again next time.